My name is Alan Edwards. I was born in 1936, so at the time of this recording, I am 86. What follows are brief recollections about my career over a period of 50 years. My time at Oswin between 1947 and 1951 is on an earlier recording. I left school in 1951 and I don't recall anyone leaving school having difficulty in securing employment. The problem was wondering what work was all about. There was little or no preparation for the outside world, as in the manner of work experience that we have today. So employment was something of a mystery. I gained a clerical position with the National Coal Board, North Eastern Division headquarters, situated on South Parade in Doncaster. Coal was big business in those days, with the division having around 112 collieries divided into 8 areas. My very first job as a 15-year-old was right at the bottom of things, so I guess I was the office boy. But it was a good beginning to understand the clerical world and the elements of organisation. I soon transferred to a department dealing with the daily reporting of coal output, absenteeism, accidents, and other activities in all 8 areas of the division. This was interesting work. As soon as I joined the coal board, I commenced further education and attended night school 4 nights a week, generally at the nearby grammar school. I was 15 years old, and I recall having an insatiable appetite for learning. Through this enjoyable and excellent night school activity, I gained a national certificate in Commerce and Maths just before commencing my national service. Preparation for national service entailed a medical examination that was held in a church hall at the top of Hallgate. A good friend, Jeff Baldwin, had completed his national service with the Royal Army Pay Corps and had generally enjoyed his service. So, for no other reason, I also joined the Royal Army Pay Corps in August 1955 for the princely sum of 28 shillings a week, £1.40 in today's money, with accommodation, food and clothing provided. Basic training was at Devizes in Wiltshire and lasted 10 weeks. Basic training in national service was generally 6 weeks, but the extra weeks for me and my fellow Pay Corps entrants covered studies in Army accounting routines. As one may expect, discipline was strict. I recall having 3 haircuts in 2 days, which was a form of punishment for wrongdoing by my platoon. My training was as a company pay clerk, CPC. The object of this training was to have CPCs in all units of the Army to conduct pay and financial affairs hitherto undertaken by regimental headquarters personnel. CPCs were required to have a basic knowledge of the activity undertaken by the unit to which they had been posted. In other words, joining an infantry regiment called for an understanding of infantry matters. Early in basic training, volunteers were sought for overseas postings. Korea was my first choice and Germany my second. As may be expected with the army, none of those of us who volunteered, around 9 out of 20, managed to get an overseas posting. And I was posted to an infantry battalion that had just returned from Kenya. This was the 1st Battalion, the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, temporarily based at Ogbourne St George, but soon to be established as demonstration battalion at the School of Infantry in Warminster, Wiltshire. The battalion was based at Nook Camp, near the village of Heytesbury, a few miles from Warminster. Occasional visits were made to the School of Infantry, and on one day at the school, I met an old classmate, Horace Harrison, who I think was in the Inniskilling Dragoon Guards. When playing cricket at nearby Sutton Veny camp, I met another school acquaintance by the name of Greg, a good goalkeeper, as I recall. I think he was in the reaming. Service in general was mostly enjoyable. In the early days, CPCs soon gained a first stripe as Lance Corporal, recognising the overall training undertaken and giving a degree of authority. A pay clerk's trade qualifications after basic training extended to 3 grades. I took my final grade exam at nearby Bulford Camp, and with about 5 others, sat at the largest table I'd ever seen. As was customary after the First World War, battalions of the same regiment were never engaged together in the same theatre of any conflict. The 1st Battalion of Inniskillings had been in Kenya at the time of the Mau Mau uprising, and the 2nd Battalion in Cyprus, where there was conflict with EOKA, a Greek organisation seeking an end to British rule and the unification of Cyprus with Greece. The 2nd Battalion eventually returned from Cyprus in 1956 to bring the Inniskillings to a regimental strength of around 1,250 personnel. In the summer of 1956, I was placed on a 10-week infantry training cadre, where success would lead to my gaining a 2nd stripe as corporal. There were about 20 of us on the cadre. The other members were Inniskillings, so being pay corps, I was the odd one out. As a 19-year-old, this was perhaps the most enjoyable time of my national service. The cadre covered the theory and practice in the use of all infantry weapons and tactical deployments. Map reading was a focus, and day and night patrols on Salisbury Plain with map and compass were enjoyable challenges. All of this was a complete bore for my Inniskilling friends, who were subject to these disciplines as a matter of course on a day-to-day basis. But for me, all was new and refreshing and quite different to my office work as a CPC. Such was my enthusiasm and enjoyment of the experience. It led to my gaining 1st place on the cadre and my 2nd stripe. The previous top of cadre was also pay corps, which underlines the view that enthusiasm and excitement for something entirely new could lead to good success. The training was far different to pen pushing in an office. My time in the army was a time of many conflicts around the world, and at the end of 1956, the Suez Crisis arose with Israeli, British, and French armed forces going to Suez when the Egyptian president, Colonel Nasser, nationalised the Suez Canal, much to the annoyance of British and French shareholders. A company of the Inniskillings, that included myself as their company pay clerk, was quickly dispatched to Aldershot as an advance party of the regiment to go to Suez. Several days were spent living under canvas, and we were then only a few hours away from transit to Egypt when the conflict suddenly ended. Another chance to go overseas was lost. There was then a more leisurely return to the School of Infantry. Army service gave opportunities for sport, and cricket, rugby and hockey were all enjoyed. Hockey seemed to me to be a most dangerous activity. I played cricket for the regiment in the surrounding areas, and on one occasion at the School of Artillery, Lark Hill, where I met a work friend, Barry Evans, who was a gunner in the artillery. I also recall the embarrassment of being out first ball. I was demobbed on 1st of August 1957, and overall I enjoyed my 2 years national service, although one generally recalls only the good times. After demob, I returned to the coal board, eventually working as PA to the divisional method study engineer, calculating anticipated output from various coal seams using different forms of mechanization. The work was enjoyable, but I had a desire to move to the private sector, and eventually joined an engineering company in Retford, W.J. Jenkins and Company Limited, that eventually became part of the Babcock Group as Babcock Jenkins. Jenkins was primarily engaged in the gas and coal industries, providing mechanical handling systems for bulk materials such as coal and ore. The nature of the business gradually embraced other handling systems and process machinery, but some heavy engineering continued. Perhaps a claim to fame was the construction of the cradle, upon which the Tudor ship Mary Rose was placed to facilitate its lifting from the seabed in the Solent in 1982. At the time of joining Jenkins, I was a student of the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators, now the Chartered Governance Institute, and I eventually qualified as an associate of the Institute and then as a fellow. I became company secretary of Jenkins and additionally a minerals processing company within the group. At the same time, I also became company secretary of Whip&Bourne Limited, a switchgear company in Rochdale, shortly after it was acquired by the Babcock Group. This was a temporary appointment for several months, and I travelled to Rochdale one day a week. Much banter arose between me as a Yorkshireman and the local Lancastrians, but they were wonderfully warm and generous people with good humour. Banter is much misunderstood these days. My company secretary role varied a little from company to company, but generally covered requirements in corporate law, contract law, property and facilities management, human resources, secretarial practice, meetings administration, import and export procedures, and the management of insurance portfolios. I spent more than 20 years in the engineering sector, but lean times brought many redundancies, and I became a casualty. My job search eventually led to my entering the financial services sector. The position I gained was as assistant company secretary of an American merchant bank in London. This was First Interstate Capital Markets Limited, based in Agar Street, just off the Strand and close to Trafalgar Square. The banking entities in the Agar Street premises arose following the bringing together of the First Interstate Bank of California and the Bank of Continental Illinois, all under the Bancorp Group with its headquarters in Los Angeles. Before moving to Berkshire in July 1987, I commuted from Retford to London on a daily basis for about 4 months. This was by rail and a round trip of approximately 270 miles. In other words, around 1,350 miles a week, merely going to work and back. Surprisingly, there were many others doing a similar daily commute, and some even from further afield. However, I had to relocate. The commute time from my eventual home in Berkshire to London was not a great deal less than the travel from Retford to London. Train and tube travel to work and back was an entirely different experience. A move from heavy engineering to merchant banking was like moving to another galaxy. Steel was replaced by currency and bond trading, financial instruments, and corporate finance. It was truly light years different. However, I eventually became company secretary of the merchant bank and 5 subsidiaries, and additionally the American Delaware Holding Company covering the UK entities. I also had statutory responsibility for companies in Madrid and Hong Kong. This was demanding work, including the need to hold 7 board meetings and 6 annual general meetings on the same day, an exacting but enjoyable day. The meetings were attended by up to 20 directors from all over the world. The Bancorp Group was worldwide and as such a 24-hour activity. It was not uncommon for me to receive a good evening phone call from Hong Kong as soon as I arrived at the office at 8 o'clock in the morning, and a good morning call from Los Angeles as I was about to go home in the early evening. At one stage, I was just required to spend a little time visiting Milan to attend to the closure of a representative office of the First Interstate Bank of California. I was sent to assist the local manager, but within a few minutes of meeting him, he told me that he was joining another bank the next day, so the task of closure was mine alone. This required me to negotiate the termination of a variety of agreements, the closing of accounts, and the disposal of all assets. I asked Los Angeles for, and I received, a resolution from the Board of Directors of the First Interstate Bank of California that gave me absolute authority to dispose of all assets and take whatever actions I deem necessary concerning the closure. This eliminated the need for me to make frequent contacts with Los Angeles for authority to take a variety of actions. I had frequent meetings with banks, auditors, lawyers, property advisors, and forwarding agents. Thankfully, one employee remained to help me. This was a very talented young Italian lady who spoke 4 languages, more than covering my lack of Italian, although many Italians I met spoke English. It was soon apparent to me that the Italian way of doing business was different to what I was used to. There was a tendency to approach some issues, not all issues, but some issues, in a laboured, roundabout manner, but these were quickly overcome, particularly in view of my workload. My young assistant, Sylvia, was taken by my directness towards resolving these issues. She attended most, if not all, of my meetings and admitted to once losing sleep in anticipation of my directness in a meeting at which she would be present. However, all went well, and she soon thought of these engagements with much amusement. When all the closure work was completed, she remarked that I was unusual. It transpired that I was the first Englishman she had encountered in a work sense. The first interstate banking group, Bancorp, with headquarters in Los Angeles, eventually experienced serious adverse trends in the real estate market. This was in the states of California, Arizona, and Nevada. Redundancy rose again, and the group was eventually acquired by Wells Fargo Bank. During the time when staff levels were being reduced in London, I was appointed one of 3 joint managing directors of an offshore banking entity in the Cayman Islands, with the 2 other directors being a Malaysian colleague and an Australian who was based in the Cayman Islands. This directorship arose simply because there were few left to hold the position. I did not look upon it as a matter of merit on my part. Nevertheless, it was an interesting time. I eventually became the last employee in the United Kingdom. I then had a 6-month consultancy agreement with Los Angeles to attend to final closure issues. In order to avoid the burden of business rates on our extensive 4-story premises in Agar Street, I moved to a small serviced office in Northumberland Avenue, that is next to Whitehall. I used to tell those visiting me that my office was 200 yards south-southeast of Nelson's Column. All the closure work eventually came to an end, and I was again between jobs. This eventually led to my entering a 4th business sector in my career, when I secured a position as company secretary and eventually becoming an executive director of the Corps of Commissionaires situated in London EC1. At that time, the Corps was primarily a man-guarding and facilities management company, providing services across a variety of sectors of industry and commerce. It was therefore a labour-intensive organisation with around 3,000 employees working in more than a dozen areas throughout the UK. So yet a different sector, and yet again a quite different culture. The Corps was created in 1859 by a Captain Sir Edward Walter, who sought to find employment for veteran servicemen following the Crimean War and the Indian Mutiny. Their employment as commissionaires commenced in the City of London, where they were trusted persons, physically moving financial funds and messages from one bank to another bank and elsewhere within the business community. In 1901, His Majesty King Edward VII consented to be head of the Board of Governors of the Corps. and since then the reigning monarch has been the Chief Life Governor of the Corps. In 2009, the Corps celebrated its 150th anniversary with a reception hosted at St James's Palace by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. Although retired at the time, I was invited to the occasion and was presented to Her Majesty the Queen, a quite wonderful lady and a memorable occasion. At the time I joined the Corps, there were many ex-service personnel and good camaraderie existed. The Corps had cousins as independent corps organisations in Canada and Australia. The basic aim of all was to find employment for ex-service personnel. Success in this attracted attention from overseas. I had meetings in Kuala Lumpur with ex-Malaysian military and in London with ex-Bulgarian military intelligence personnel who both sought to have similar arrangements in their own countries. The Bulgarians were interesting, likeable people and were, of course, ex-Warsaw Pact, opposing NATO at the time of the Cold War. In 1996, I formed a Corps security company in Papua New Guinea to undertake man guarding and cash-in-transit roles. PNG, as Papua New Guinea is often referred to, was a little unruly. At least that was the case in Port Moresby. It was decidedly unwise to go out for a stroll in hours of darkness. People lived in compounds and perimeters were topped with barbed wire, razor wire. A somewhat vague issue, details of which were not apparent to many, including myself, caused some to believe that there was an element of personal risk to myself and to my two colleagues as long as we remained in PNG. It was therefore comforting to have security personnel present at times that included suitably armed ex-Australian SAS. Nevertheless, PNG was and undoubtedly remains a wonderful and interesting country. Dense jungle covers a large area. It has been said that 2/3 of the world's languages are spoken in PNG. Many different tribes inhabit the interior. The Corps' focus was initially in Port Moresby and its environs. Visits to PNG were inclined to be hectic. My first visit commenced on a Wednesday with a full day's work in London, and then to Heathrow for a 10:45 evening flight to Singapore. It was then a change to Air New Guinea for an onward 6-hour flight to Port Moresby. During this flight, one of my colleagues was reading a travel guide for PNG. He was shocked and exclaimed when reading that after being bitten by a particular spider, or it may have been a snake, the limb was to be removed at the earliest opportunity. This was not good news. I recall arriving at Jackson's Airport in Port Moresby at 6 a.m. on the Friday morning, and even at that time it was hot and particularly humid. I had a meeting with brokers at the airport at 7 a.m. and then a meeting at the Capital District Town Hall at 11 a.m. These were followed with a meeting in the afternoon with local businessmen who were considering establishing a new township about 20 kilometres from Port Moresby, who wished to consider security during the construction of the township and post-construction. By the end of those meetings, I reflected that I had spent 3 days and 2 nights without taking my shoes and socks off. Travel in PNG was generally limited to the areas surrounding Port Moresby and Bootless Bay. Nearby was the end of the Kokoda Trail, a trail where in 1942 the Japanese advance was halted by Australian troops. Many locals were in the habit of chewing betel nut, which is a mild narcotic when chewed with a lime. Saliva became red and when spat out, caused stains to appear on many a footpath. Some indigenous music in PNG has only 2 or 3 notes, if you can call it music. One evening I was having a shower and a guy was outside my room on the walkway balcony surrounding all rooms, irritatingly whistling the customary few notes. It went on and on. I determined to tell him to move away when I left my room, only to find him skimpily dressed and holding a bow and arrow. The arrow was already nocked. I soon decided that I would not tell him to move away. We merely smiled and went our separate ways. There was a little encroaching greenery at the side of the hotel, and he was part of hotel security, with a focus on that area. On a visit to the Kokoda Trail, an event occurred that prompted me to think of a classmate of mine, John Gilligan. It was nothing more than a short stretch of road that was strangely near identical to one near Bawtry, where I once saw John stood. This was many years after leaving school. I reflected that secondary modern days seemed a long, long time ago. Directors leaving the Corps of Commissionaires eventually led to my becoming acting managing director for several months, not long before my retirement. The culture was gradually changing, and I retired in 2001. This concludes my brief recollections about my career. I reflect that from secondary modern days and my first job as office boy to my later activities and positions presents an interesting and eventful journey. I have visited numerous countries during my 50-year journey, and wherever I have been in the world, most recently China, I have generally found people of all nationalities, both young and old, to be friendly. It is a pity that differing beliefs and ideologies produce the divisions and conflicts that seem to be ever present in the world today, when friendships abound worldwide.
If you would like to know more about the Ossie Through the Ages project, then please email me at tonyarmstrong1959@outlook.com. Thank you.